It's a great honor and indeed a privilege to have been particularly invited by Tate Sam to do the official launch of the extended edition of his autobiography, Agony of Truth. I feel very small, very much small, to perform this task, given the longevity and experiences of Tate Sam. During the launch of the first edition, held on the 5th of May 2014 at the Nampa Convention, I had an easy task, which was to be the director of the program, as well as to do the opening and closing prayers. Professor Disho, as you have heard, was the guest speaker, and it was him who did the official launch. It was befitting for him, Professor Disho, to perform such a task because he comes from the liberation generations, especially during the formation of the student organization called NANSO. Before then, I opened this second edition. I would like to reflect on what I've said when I did the prayers at the first edition. I started off by offering some reflections on storytelling, and I said, every one of us has a story to tell. I pointed out that the difficulty, or rather a challenge of humanity, is our interrelatedness. We cannot, or rather we can only be human together, so we hear quite often. But the problem comes when our humanity and our understanding thereof is consumed by suspicion, mistrust, distrust, and when our humanity is consumed by envy, fear, jealousy, hate, and all sorts of evil forces of darkness. Infected and infested with these, then our interrelation and our interdependence is crippled, and human fabric is torn at its deepest level. As a result, we seek by all means to avoid, to push aside, to defeat, to humiliate, and worse than that, we seek to eliminate one another as we try to solve our relational problems. It doesn't matter what type of relationship that is, for as long as we tend to eliminate one another in order to solve the problem, maybe to hide the truth, or whatever the case might be. Furthermore, it seems to me that such challenge is exacerbated when we fail to accept the reality of our common life and our common humanity, which is a mixture of joy and sadness, a mixture of truth and falsehood. They have always been going hand in hand. A mixture of light and darkness, a mixture of love and hate, and for the mixture of life and death. As much as and as long as we live, I am convinced that in the midst of all the confusions, toils, and tribulations. Each and every one of us has and will have a story to tell. Some stories might be good and sweet to tell, hear, and swallow. Others might be too bitter to tell, let alone to hear and accept. The fact remains, whether we like that story or we don't like it, everyone has a story to tell. I poetically put some ideas here to give us an idea that a young man will approach a young woman, and he must not always think he has the last word. She will have a story also to tell. Whether to send you away or whatever the case may be. Parents at home, husbands and wives, they should have stories to tell each other. Not just one person dictating. They will also have stories to tell their children. And children also will have a story to share with their parents. Doctors in hospitals and nurses. Patients will also have stories to share with them. Teachers in classroom. Leaders. It becomes autocratic when a leader thinks he has the last word. Even God, the Creator, the only one to be feared, supposedly, has not closed his communication with a sinful man. Some fellow in the ecclesiastical circles wished it to be different, but God does not allow it. He has a story to tell, and he asks his people also to tell him something. To the point of having freedom to differ with him, provided they know the consequences of such differences. So my dear brothers and sisters, each and every one of us has a story to tell. It is my sincere hope that we do agree with that. It means our relatedness, or the relatedness and interconnectedness of humanity, is only based on storytelling. Call it communication if you like. The storyteller should indicate how he wants his story to be told. In my view, he tells or she tells her story, and the audience listens. It's a two-way communication. The narrator, with necessary boldness, with due humility, and the necessary conviction and honesty, he narrates the story. As the audience listen carefully, attentively, and even critically. Storytelling is not just a hobby, but it can be a healing exercise. There is nothing so bad and agonizing than being denied an opportunity to speak and share your story, no matter what type of a story it is. Whether you are forced to do that, to keep quiet, or people ignore you, it's bad and agonizing. The temptation is, and it will always be, I would think, we are only prepared to listen to those stories that we like or want. But can that be a possibility in a diverse society such as ours? I don't believe that. Stories in societies like ours will be but a reflection of such diversity. Think of this nation in terms of its historical, cultural, traditional, customary, racial, tribal, social, political, economical, and also religious diversity. This means we must be braced to be positioned in that space in which we have to listen, not to what we want or like, but to the expressions of hopes and aspirations from the diverse people of this land. Doesn't matter you share their ideas or not. It gives them a healing if somebody lends them a listening ear. Do we always have to agree with the stories being told? Not necessarily. But stories have the capacity to awaken in us a new revelation and understanding. They may even bring us closer to a reality or unknown truth. Always remember that the storyteller might have seen what you have not seen, might have heard what you have not heard, might have been to places where you have never been and probably will never be or go. Might have done things that you can only dream about. But what is important is to listen. Listen with receptive, analytical, and a critical mind with a human heart. Why are we here today? We are here today at this moment, but to encourage this process of listening. We do not seek, I think, to pass a judgment against anyone, nor are we here to issue a condemnation order, not even a justification for that matter, but to listen to a life story as is narrated in the book of a fellow citizen. This story is narrated in the book is a life story of someone who was born and bred in Namibia. He is not a ghost from a different planet so that he can be ignored. He is one of us, our own brother, our friend, fellow citizen, a colleague, and even in political terms, a comrade. It is his time to have his story told, and we have an obligation to hear that story. And that is now, that is Samson Ndeikwila. And as I alluded to earlier, I mean the audience, use our eyes to see, and we have our ears to hear as we listen to him when he will speak to us thereafter. And then we will use our minds and hearts together to contemplate and meditate on what he has to say. Our mission today is to listen. For clergy like me, is for both pastoral and historical benefit that I have to listen to him. For some, it is for academic purposes, while for others, it's for social research. Others might be for curiosity or sympathy or compassion. But the point is, let us listen. The agony of truth. Why agony? Why truth telling is always agonizing. We have to think about that. Why agony? When the truth in the biblical terms supposed to free, but it appears now truth is the bitter pill one had to swallow by telling it or listening to it. As I come closer to the end of this reflection, and just before I present the book for consideration, allow me to reflect in few sentences some of the biblical situations in which everyone had a story to tell. If you will read Genesis chapter 31, verses 36 to 42, I have no time to read now because I'm not in the church to preach, but it's for you to read later at home. I like one statement. And Jacob was angry, and he took Laban to task. I like that statement. Jacob was angry, and he took Laban to task. You remember the story of Jacob and Laban? They agreed, Jacob to look after the sheep and whatever, so that he gets a girl for marriage. But Laban gave him a wrong one. And he asked Jacob to do 7 years again for another girl, and then 6 more years to look after the flock. But he changed his wage several times. And that is why that's the reason why Jacob was angry, and he took Laban to task. I hate, of course, the hypocrisy of Laban and his unfair and unjust ways of dealing with his employee who had worked so hard to make him rich. I recognize his boldness, though, to make peace with Jacob. And that reconciliation covenant was reached. If you read further, we thank God for the boldness of Jacob, who told his story in no uncertain terms, so that Laban understands that I have a pain in my heart for what you have done. And Jacob had no reason to argue, but to accept his wrongdoings. The problem with us, if you read this book, has a lot of regrettable experiences experienced by fellow Namibians, especially in exile. And will there be anyone listening and come out boldly to say, we or I am sorry for what I have done, like what Laban did to Jacob? If you read the book of Daniel then, chapter 3, verse 16 to 18, you remember the story of 3 men in the lake of fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their only sin was to stay true to their convictions, identity, and beliefs. So someone plotted against them, pleading with King Nebuchadnezzar to eliminate them. But they had a story to tell King Nebuchadnezzar and his cohorts in no uncertain terms, whatever the outcome. But God vindicated them. It was in agony that they had to tell their story. It was not an easy task, because truth is always agonizing. Everyone had a story to tell. And finally, Daniel, in chapter 6, verse 21 to 22, those are 2 verses. We know what happens. The story of Daniel is one of that one of the legendary. He had an unpleasant story with King Darius, and as a result, he was to be eliminated, just like his 3 friends mentioned earlier. He went then to the den of lions with conviction that God will see him through as he did. So when King Darius came to inquire if his favorite servant, who was being betrayed by others, is alive. Daniel had a story to tell, a very beautiful one. May the king always live. I was found innocent in the eyes of God. That's a reconciliatory statement that most of the time it is those who have been wronged who will always have to take a strong stand to forgive the offenders. It is therefore obvious that whenever the story is to be told and leave behind a long-lasting impact, it must be told in the following characteristics or manner. The story must be truthful and correct. The story must be principled. The story must be honest. The storyteller must be bold and with conviction, and the story shall be told with clarity and with fewer words. The storyteller should and shall be able to defend his story and repel the malicious critics when necessary. In other words, the story should stand the test of times. If the story misses some of those marks, then it becomes a fallacy and a myth, and the possibility is that it might be thrown away in the dustbins of history. In conclusion, therefore, my dear people of God and the people of this land, it is my sincere hope and a belief that the version contained in the book before us is true and correct. It is for those who have a different version against what is contained therein to bring their protestation to the fore, indeed with evidence to the contrary, so that the reader can then compare and contrast. Many a times things do happen the way they do due to lack of knowledge or lack of information. And the reason why we have history as a discipline in schools and universities is to save the world from repeating the mistakes of the past. George Santayana, a Spanish philosopher and a poet, once said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." End of quote. And finally, like Amos, the prophet of the Bible, I end by saying, "But let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing streams." In that spirit, I hereby declare that the Agony of Truth, an autobiography of Samson Ndeikwila, an extended edition, is officially launched. And I thank you.